Crystal Lawson's truck announced itself before it arrived. The old 1998 Ford F-150 rattled across the scale at Clymer Grain and Rensselaer, coughed once, and exhaled a rope of blue smoke that drifted past the office window. She parked between a polished F350 King Ranch and a white dually with chrome wheel covers so bright they mirrored the gray sky. She stepped down in a faded feed store jacket with a stitched tear across the right shoulder, mended gloves, and mud on boots that had been resoled twice. Her hair was twisted under a cap advertising a fertilizer dealer that had gone bankrupt in 2014. She carried a green ledger notebook, not a phone. Inside the coffee station sat beside a basket of biscuits wrapped in wax paper. $2 for coffee, $4 for breakfast. Crystal walked past both and unscrewed her own thermos. Behind her in line stood Brandon Kell, who had just financed a new combine and wanted everyone to know it. Starched pearl snap shirt, gold watch. Keys to a 2024 Silverado ZR2 clipped where they could jingle. He leaned toward the dispatcher and said, not quite quietly, "If she ever upgrades that truck, I'll buy lunch for the county." The dispatcher snorted. "Crystal, squeeze Lincoln till he hollers." Brandon grinned at Crystal. "You still counting coffee pennies?" She poured from the thermos and answered without heat. 38 cents a cup at home. $2 here. 3 cups a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks. That's $1,215 a year before biscuits. He laughed like she was putting on a skit for him. "You can't save your way rich, Crystal." She capped the thermos, signed the moisture adjustment ticket, and tucked it in her notebook. "No," she said, "but you can borrow your way poor." Outside, his truck doors shut with the heavy thump of new insulation, while hers needed a shoulder slam. The contrast always seemed to settle the lot around her. From the jokes and side glances, Crystal could tell most of them preferred a story they could read in one glance. Successful men in clean denim, struggling woman in patched canvas. The story held because she and her husband, Wade, actually did work hard enough to look tired. They farmed 410 acres of corn and soybeans, fed out 120 head of cattle, and still bought used parts in cash. If appearances were all you counted, they were one bad harvest from trouble. As far as Crystal could tell, nobody at Clymer Grain had ever bothered to calculate what sat behind that look, because nobody asked, and the Lawsons never volunteered. Their operation had carried no debt for 19 years. Not operating line, not machinery note, not land mortgage. Their liquid reserve sat in laddered U.S. Treasury bills spread across 4, 13, and 26-week maturities, totaling $1,184,000 and averaging 4.6% annualized that summer. Their wealth looked like caution. Their caution looked like poverty. Most days, that misunderstanding suited Crystal fine. She had not been born frugal. She had been taught it in pieces, then burned by its opposite. When Crystal was 14, her father refinanced their family ground to buy bigger equipment after 2 high-priced crop years in a row. He used the phrase everybody used then, leverage the upside. The loan officer said they were positioning for scale. The salesman said a new planner would pay for itself by speed. Crystal remembered the exact number because her mother wrote it on an envelope and kept it in the junk drawer. $286,400 at 8.25%, variable after 36 months. By the time Crystal was 19, rain had come wrong 2 years out of 3, soybean basis widened, and rates reset up. Her father stopped sleeping through the night. Then he started avoiding the mailbox. The bank sent certified letters. One evening, she found him at the kitchen table, staring at a legal pad covered in circles and arrows around one figure. Interest due, $23,114 next quarter. He looked up and said, I can grow anything but cash. They sold 80 acres first, then the machine shed line by line. Her father kept one old tractor and a bitterness he wore like a brace. At 21, Crystal was balancing feed receipts at a kitchen counter where foreclosure papers had once been stacked by category. She absorbed the lesson the way some people absorb religion. Debt doesn't care whether you're a good person, only whether you're late. Wade had his own version. His mother cleaned motel rooms in Lafayette and kept cash in canning jars under the sink because she did not trust banks after an overdraft cascade ate a paycheck in 1997. Wade learned diesel mechanics in the Army Reserve, came home, and discovered farmers would rather patch old equipment in August than sign for new in March. He met Crystal at an auction where she was bidding on a used grain auger, and he was buying a salvage baler for parts. Their first conversation was about bearings. "Seized?" he asked, nodding at the auger. "Not yet," she said. "But it's whining," he said. "Don't grease over a bad race. You'll just postpone expensive." She liked that sentence enough to marry him 19 months later. They started with leased acres, one calf lot, and a shared checking account whose balance once dropped to $412.08 before hay payment cleared. In year one, they made a rule and marker on an index card and taped it inside the pantry. If we can't buy it twice, we can't buy it once. That rule killed a lot of wants. It also saved them when diesel spiked above $4 and their landlord raised rent, the same week a feed truck invoice came due. In year three, they replaced a 10-year machinery note with an envelope system. One envelope for equipment replacement, one for taxes, one for emergency repairs. They made themselves put something in each envelope every month, even if it was $20 and apology level thin. Crystal built a spreadsheet later, but the envelopes came first. In year six, after 2 profitable seasons, they had enough to put 20% down on 80 acres. The bank officer offered to optimize cash flow with a 30-year note and a larger credit line. Crystal asked for terms and came home with a folder full of rate tables. She and Wade sat at the kitchen table and ran scenarios until midnight. Best case, they built faster with debt. Average case, they bled in down years and extended terms. Worst case, one drought, plus one health event, put their house in play. Wade tapped the column marked worst and said, "I'd rather be slower than owned." They bought 40 acres in cash instead. Neighbors called it timid. 8 years later, they bought the adjoining 40 from an estate sale, also cash. They drove the same trucks, wore patched coats, and quietly kept compounding what they did not spend. When cattle checks came in strong, they did not celebrate with machinery. They bought 4-week T-bills and rolled them. When corn rallied, they paid ahead on fertilizer to lock discounts, then swept surplus into 13-week bills. Over time, their reserve grew in disciplined, boring increments. $90,000, then $240,000, then $600,000. The million mark arrived on a Tuesday with no ceremony and a broken gate hinge that still needed welding. Folks called Crystal severe sometimes, and she knew why. Her discipline did not soften with success. She tracked fuel by 10th gallon in a ruled logbook clipped to the shop wall. She knew exactly which field approaches added idle time, which drivers left engines running too long, which grain routes wasted miles. She could tell you that replacing one worn fan belt before failure saved an average of $740 in downtime and emergency labor. She could tell you that a used Riemann hydraulic pump at $1,180, installed by Wade in-house, beat a dealer replacement at $3,900 plus haul fee. In March, at the Kankakee equipment auction, she stood in drizzle beside men in branded jackets who smelled like new leather and financing confidence. Lot 117 was a 12-row planter with cosmetic rust, meter wear, and one bent marker arm. The auctioneer started at $18,000. A dealer rep in clean boots pushed it to $26,500. Crystal stopped at $27,000, waited, then lifted two fingers at $27,250. The rep hesitated, checked his phone, and dropped out. Sold, $27,250. The same model, 2 years newer and prettier, was listing at dealerships for $64,900, financed at 7.9%. By the time they hauled it home, more than one person had told her she got lucky. Those same voices were not in the shop while Wade and Crystal spent 3 evenings rebuilding meters, replacing chains, straightening the arm with heat and patience, and calibrating row units one by one. Parts cost $4,380. Paint, none. Total all in, $31,630. They put 1,100 acres through it, that spring between their ground and custom work, then logged every skipped row and downtime minute in a binder. By harvest, the planter had paid for itself against their old setup's inefficiency and custom margin. Their house told the same story. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, linoleum patched near the stove, freezer in the mudroom humming louder than polite company. Crystal canned tomatoes, bought detergent in bulk when unit pricing worked, and darned socks while market reports played on AM radio. Wade could rebuild a gearbox, but still cut his own hair over a tarp in the garage because $12 a month was $12 a month. They were not pretending. This was the system. The first week of July, the system met a force bigger than thrift. By then, rain deficits had stacked over 2 seasons, and county wells were dropping faster than extension forecasts had predicted. Pastures browned early. Pond edges turned to cracked clay. At the sale barn, cattle stood around water tanks like men at the last open gas station before a storm. Then the state notice came. Emergency pumping limits, effective immediately. Livestock water allocations reduced by 35% under drought protocol. One paragraph in a PDF hit harder than a hailstorm. At nearly the same time, Prairie State Ag Bank posted foreclosure notices on 11 parcels within hauling distance of the Lawson farm. At the co-op and elevator, Crystal heard the parcels talked about as distressed acres. She looked at the legal descriptions and saw something else. Grandfathered high-capacity wells drilled before permit caps tightened. Auction dates set 12 days apart, like dominoes set for speed. At supper, she spread printed notices across the table between 2 chipped plates of pork and beans. Wade read in silence, jaw working. "She's ugly out there," he said finally. "Everybody's tight." "Exactly," Crystal said. She had already penciled columns, expected bid ranges, rehab estimates, transport costs for temporary nurse tanks, potential lease demand under rationing. Most of them want the wells. Most of them can't close. Because rates reset. Operating notes jumped from 5.25 to over 9. Banks are asking 40% down on anything distressed. She slid him another sheet. "If we can buy under $2.4 million and keep carrying below $82,000 a year, water decides winter, not acreage." Wade stared at the numbers, thumb rubbing the table edge until it squeaked. "Crystal," he said, voice careful, "this is bigger than a planter." She nodded. "I know." Outside, wind pushed dust across the yard where grass should have been. The old F-150 sat by the shop, paint dull, tailgate chained, looking exactly like what everyone thought it was, a truck owned by people hanging on. Inside, under a yellow kitchen light, Crystal Lawson circled the first auction date in red and wrote one word in the margin of her ledger. Water. Water. She closed the ledger, then opened it again and turned back 20 years. "Before we touch $1, she said, "I want to see the whole staircase." Wade stood, rinsed his plate, and came back with the plastic crate they kept under the hall table. Old tax folders, yield sheets, yellow legal pads from years when they couldn't afford software worth trusting. Crystal spread them in date order across the kitchen. 2005 to present, one stack for farm income, one for household, one for reserves and treasury rolls. She started reading numbers out loud, not for nostalgia, but for proof. Year 1 together, gross revenue $212,000. Net after rent, inputs, fuel, feed, and repairs, $26,400. We set aside $6,000 total, $4,000 to emergency, $2,000 to taxes. Wade nodded. And we still patched that combine auger with flat bar. Year 2, diesel spike. Net fell to 19,800. Saved 4,200. No machinery purchases. Year 3, custom haying added 11,000 gross. We kept 7 after labor and parts. Year 4, she said, tapping a sheet with grease fingerprints. First good corn year. Net 62. We did not buy a pickup. He smiled once. Still hear that from your uncle. She kept going. In year 6, they had $87,000 liquid and bought 40 acres cash for $76,000 from an estate that wanted quick close. In year 7, they rebuilt the cattle lot fence for $9,400 themselves instead of hiring it out for nearly $22,000. In year 8, they expanded feeder capacity from 60 to 85 head by pouring pads in stages, $3,100, then $2,700, then $4,400. Never all at once, never financed. Year 9, they replaced 2 grain bin fans before failure and avoided losing a wet corn load that would have cost roughly $18,000 in discounts and spoilage. Year 10 was the first year Crystal labeled boring surplus in her notes, and she had underlined boring twice. They cleared $143,000 after all operating costs and taxes, set aside $61,000 for replacement, and started buying short-term treasuries monthly instead of quarterly. She'd written the latter on an index card then. Keep 1/3 maturing every 4 weeks, 1/3 every 13, 1/3 every 26. No excuses. Year 11, they bought the adjoining 40 acres for $112,000 cash. Year 12, anhydrous prices jumped and pasture failed. They still netted positive because they had prepaid part of fertilizer in January and had no debt service line eating the margin. They swept $38,000 into 13-week bills at yields that looked small to everybody else but never lost principal. Year 13 was ugly across the county. A wet spring delayed planting, then basis widened at harvest. Their net from crops alone was thin enough to scare younger operators. Crystal's note in the margin read, "No debt means thin is survivable." Year 14, they replaced a loader tractor with a used model bought private party for $41,500 cash. Same month, 3 neighbors signed 7-year notes north of $100,000 for newer models. Year 15, they crossed $600,000 in liquid reserves. Year 16, they put up a used grain leg purchased from a closing elevator auction. $28,000 for equipment, $19,000 in concrete and electrical. Installed over winter with Wade and 2 local guys paid by the day. Equivalent new install had quoted at $146,000. Their version wasn't pretty, but it loaded. Year 17, cattle margins narrowed, so Crystal cut herd from 140 back to 120 instead of borrowing for higher feed inventory. Pride reduction, she called it. Saved cash, slept better. Year 18, they crossed $900,000 in treasuries and municipal cash equivalents. Year 19, they crossed $1 million. This summer, with recent bill yields higher, the reserve sat at $1,184,000, generating enough interest to cover property taxes and then some. Wade leaned over the table. How much can we move without breaking the ladder? Right now, 4-week maturity. Friday gives us 280. Next week, another 210. We can liquidate secondary market if we must, but I'd rather let them roll off. She penciled a box around dates aligning with the first 3 auctions. If bids stay sane, we can deploy 700 without touching grain inventory. And if they don't stay sane, we walk. She said it flat, and she meant it. But she also wrote a second number in the corner. Max total $2,400,000. By Sunday afternoon, she had converted 2 decades of caution into a 1-page acquisition discipline sheet. Parcel tax burden, pump condition score, casing depth, known easement disputes, expected rehab range, and the only column that mattered in red ink, cash payback at conservative lease rate. When she showed Wade, he whistled low. Looks like bank underwriting. No, she said. Bank underwriting assumes the bank survives first. Monday morning at the co-op, the bulletin board by the feed counter had become a gallery of stress. Foreclosure notices clipped in rows, legal descriptions in dense type, auction dates circled in marker by curious hands. Men stood with seed caps pushed back, reading like they were scanning obituaries. Brandon Kell was there again, less shine in him this week. You looking at these too? He asked Crystal. I read anything that can change my water, she said. He exhaled through his nose. I called Prairie State Friday. Wanted to get pre-approved on Parcel 4. They told me 40% down, fixed note only, personal guarantee, and they'd revalue my machinery first. What did they appraise at? Less than payoff. He gave a short laugh with no humor. 2 years ago, dealers said my combine was worth 410. Bank says today, 265. A silence settled between them that wasn't hostile, just tired. Brandon had done what extension meetings and lenders encouraged for a decade. Expand while rates were low, capture efficiency, spread fixed costs over more acres. In 2018, he refinanced to buy 320 rented acres when an older operator retired. In 2019, he added a high-horsepower tractor at 3.9% variable and 2 grain carts on manufacturer terms. In 2021 and 2022, high commodity prices covered everything and made it look brilliant. Then rates reset, insurance climbed, fertilizer stayed stubborn, and rent contracts didn't care about his story. He stared at the notices. People think I bought toys. I bought time. Bigger equipment let me get over more ground in shorter windows. I know, Crystal said. He looked at her, surprised by no judgment. Doesn't matter now. Interest on my operating line alone is about 21 grand a month in season. Across the room, Mitch Harlan from north of Wheatfield sat with 2 co-op board members, cap in both hands like a boy in the principal's office. Mitch ran 1,100 acres, mostly rented, and had expanded hog finishing 3 years earlier with a construction loan pegged to floating rates. Last year, his debt service was manageable. This year, after resets and feed swings, his annual interest burden had climbed above $312,000 before principal. He wasn't reckless. He was leveraged in a world that had changed faster than contracts. Near the doorway, Anna and Luis Reyes argued quietly over a printout. The Reyes brothers had bought a new pivot package and remote monitoring system in 2020 when parts were cheap and financing was promotional. They did everything modern and still got pinned when replacement nozzles delayed, yields missed projections, and two landlords raised rent 18% in the same winter. Their banker required additional collateral in May. They pledged equipment. By July, they were one payment from covenant breach. No one at the co-op looked like villains. They looked like people who had believed in growth under one set of rules and woke under another. The co-op board chair, Darrell Voss, saw Crystal studying the notices and said, loud enough for others to hear, "Well, if everybody hoards cash long enough, sure, you can pick bones." A few chuckles, uneasy. Crystal didn't rise to it. "I'm not buying bones, Darrell. I'm buying pumps." He snorted. Same thing this year. Maybe it was. But she had learned long ago that moral language often followed money too late to matter. By the first auction day, heat sat on Jasper County like an iron lid. The courthouse lawn grass had gone brittle and gray. Pickup tires crunched gravel so dry it sounded like cornflakes. The auctioneer's trailer speakers hissed in the humidity while attorneys shuffled folders in shades of blue and manila. Crystal and Wade stood near the back, not hiding, just unadorned. She held a cashier's check envelope and her one-page underwriting sheet clipped to a legal pad. First parcel, 86 acres, one grandfathered well, pump house caved on one corner, unclear electrical service status, taxes current through prior year. Bidding opened at $180,000, jumped to $260,000 in 30 seconds. A man in loafers from a Chicago firm, Prairie Meridian Capital, according to his badge, raised in crisp increments without looking up. Local operators stretched once or twice, then stalled. Financing contingencies were read aloud, then read again. More than one bidder lowered his hand after hearing required close windows. $295, do I hear 300? Crystal waited. 300 from bidder 12. Loafers. 320. Crystal. 325. Wade looked straight ahead, jaw tight. At $356,000, the local feedlot operator dropped. At $372,000, the Chicago man paused, phone to his ear, then nodded at $380,000. Crystal ran her thumb down her sheet. Projected rehab high-end, $64,000. Annual maintenance reserve, $9,000. Conservative lease demand, strong within 6-mile radius. At $390,000, her cash payback window stretched but still held. She bid $392,000. The auctioneer sang, $392, fair warning." No response from loafers. Gavel. Sold. Wade exhaled like he'd been underwater. Won. They didn't celebrate. They drove home, checked cattle tanks, and replaced a float valve before dark. The second and third auctions came within days. One parcel had clean casing records and drew heavier competition. Crystal stepped out 2 bids before her cap. Another had a neglected well everyone feared was dead. She bid it aggressively after reviewing 30-year county drawdown logs and drilling reports that suggested the aquifer lens remained stronger there than gossip claimed. She won at $221,000. By the end of 12 days, she had secured 3 parcels and passed on 2 that no longer penciled. Total committed, $901,000. Cash outflows staggered with T-bill maturities exactly as planned. Then August got mean. USDA revised yield expectations downward. December corn futures slid hard. Local cash bids followed. Within 3 weeks, corn in the county moved from maybe okay to $4.12 conversations at every scale house. At the same time, 2 of the Lawson cattle contracts were repriced under drought-stressed terms, cutting projected farm income by $146,000 versus Crystal's June estimate. Wade found her at midnight in the office with the spreadsheet open and a flashlight between his teeth from fixing a breaker. "Tell me straight," he said, light muffling the words. "We still safe?" She turned the screen toward him. Base farm operations still solvent under stress because debt service remained zero. Their worst-case operating margin shrank but did not flip red. The acquisitions, however, now carried reputational risk and liquidity pressure if rehab costs blew out. "Safe isn't the word," she said. "Controlled is the word." 2 days later, pump contractor estimates arrived for the first 3 wells. Combined rehabilitation, $214,000 if no major casing failure. More if motors were beyond salvage. Wade sat on an overturned bucket in the shop, estimate pages in hand. "That's a lot of iron." "It is. You still convinced?" Crystal laid out county water level records from 1993 onward, printouts marked in highlighter. These wells were drilled deep enough to ride bad summers. Pump tests show drawdown rebound in acceptable bands. If we integrate and lease access, conservative rates still cover this in under 3 years. 2.8, he asked, remembering her earlier figure. 2.8 if maintenance stays inside reserve discipline. He looked at her a long time, then nodded once. "Then we fix pumps." The casualties started posting publicly by Labor Day. Prairie State filed accelerated foreclosure on Mitch Harlan's hog site after a covenant breach tied to debt service coverage dropping below 1.1. His note package, once routine, had reset high enough that even decent production couldn't bridge. He sold 2 semis and a grain trailer line to make payroll, and still missed. The Reyes brothers surrendered their newest pivot to avoid cross-default on land leases, then lost 3 rented quarters when landlords demanded prepay they couldn't provide. Luis took overnight shifts at a plastics plant in Remington to keep health insurance active for the family. Brandon Kell listed his 2024 Silverado and 1 grain cart. "Never thought I'd sell rolling stock in August," he told Crystal at Clymer Grain, eyes red from lack of sleep. "But bank wants principal reduction before they'll extend." Foreclosure notices multiplied. 11 parcels became not enough. Whispers said more were coming. Tanker trucks from 2 counties overcharged panic rates to haul water, and some livestock operators paid because there was no alternative. In that same stretch, Crystal's mail brought something else. A glossy letter from Prairie Meridian Capital requesting a meeting regarding regional water asset aggregation opportunities. She folded it once and stuck it under the salt shaker. On the 3rd week of September, she drove the old F-150 past cracked ditches and brown bean edges to inspect another distressed parcel, this one with a rusted sign half hidden in weeds. Wade followed in the service truck with tools to pull a test sample if they gained access. She parked, shut off the coughing engine, and listened. No frogs, no wind in green leaves, just the tick of hot metal cooling and, faintly, the electric hum of a pump on somebody else's ground still running hard. Crystal opened her ledger on the hood and wrote a new line beneath water, "Acquire flow, or buy feedlot funerals." Then she capped her pen, looked at Wade, and said, "Next auction's Tuesday. Let's go see what everyone else thinks is broken." Tuesday came white-hot and windless. The parcel everyone called broken sat on the edge of an old hay tract with a pump shed listing 2 degrees off level and cottonwood roots pushing up through the gravel pad. The auctioneer read the disclaimer twice. unknown motor condition, unknown control panel status, unknown historical output. Men muttered scrap value and money pit. Crystal had already paid for a downhole camera inspection the afternoon before, $1,150 cash to a well tech out of Kentland who owed Wade a favor. The footage wasn't pretty, but the casing was intact below the top corrosion, and static level recovery looked better than rumor. Bidding opened at $90,000 and crawled. At $142,000, a local investor stopped. At $155,000, Prairie Meridian's man in loafers lifted a card without expression. Crystal raised to $160,000. He moved to $165,000. She took one breath, checked her red ink cap, and said, 167. Silence. Gavel. By noon, she had won a second parcel that day, too. Clean title, weak pump, strong easement access for $244,000. Total across 5 purchased parcels now stood at $1,312,000. On the courthouse steps, Darrell Voss shook his head as she passed. You're either braver than smart or richer than you look. Crystal kept walking. Could be both. Could be neither. The 6th auction drew a crowd big enough to block the clerk's doorway. Word had spread that the Chicago Fund was willing to package bids and that the Lawson woman kept showing up with checks instead of contingencies. Prairie Meridian pushed hard this round. Crystal did not win the first lot. She let it go at a price that broke her payback rule. Wade didn't speak until they reached the shade by the war memorial. You okay? I'm fine, she said. Bad numbers are bad numbers even when we want them. The second lot of the day was the one that mattered. A 96-acre parcel with a grandfathered, high-capacity well and an old service line that could be tied into 2 of her new sites with fewer than 1.8 miles of trenching. Bidding climbed fast. $210,000, $230,000, $241,000. $247, Crystal said. Loafers, $250. Crystal, $250. The auctioneer blinked. Ma'am, I have $250 already. $250,001, she said. A few people laughed. Even the auctioneer grinned. I'll take legal increments. Ms. Lawson. Then $251. Loafers hesitated, checked his phone, and said nothing. Sold. That put her at 6 parcels, $1,563,000 committed. Then came the challenge. Prairie Meridian's representative spoke to the bank attorney, then to the auctioneer. Minutes later, the microphone crackled. Before proceeding to final confirmation, we need immediate verification of funds from bidder 12 due to the cumulative awards and shortened closing windows. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Somebody behind Crystal whispered, Told you she'd hit a wall. Wade shifted beside her, but Crystal only opened her canvas folder. Inside were cashier's checks, maturity notices, and a letter on First Jasper Community Bank letterhead signed that morning by branch manager Judy Klein. The attorney read it, cleared his throat, and because protocol required public statement once challenged, read key lines aloud. As of 9:02 a.m. today, Lawson Farm Operations holds $1,972,430 in immediately available cash and cash equivalent instruments, inclusive of treasury bills maturing within 21 days. The operation carries 0 secured long-term debt and no liens against current machinery schedules. The crowd went still enough to hear the flag rope hit the pole. Darrell Voss actually laughed once, short and stunned. Brandon Kell just stared at Crystal like he'd never seen her before. The attorney kept reading. Additional unencumbered real property appraised at $3.9 million. Thank you, Crystal said. That'll do. But it had already done what it was going to do. For years, people had mistaken patched cuffs for insolvency and a smoking truck for failure. Now, on courthouse concrete in full sun, the number sat in the open like an overturned grain cart. Undeniable. Someone near the back said, not quietly, "You're kidding me." Crystal capped her pen and slid the folder shut. "No," she said. "I'm just boring." By the end of that week, she closed on Parcel 7 for $197,000 after 2 financing contingencies failed for other bidders. 7 wells. $1,760,000 total acquisition cost. The day the deeds recorded, Wade replaced a broken float in their own north tank and then drove straight to the first rehab site. There was nothing glamorous about what came next. Mud, trench spoil, electric permits, pressure tests, impeller swaps, rewiring old control boxes, and 1 week of cussing at a relay that kept tripping under load. Contracted rehab estimates had started at $214,000. Crystal cut that by doing labor in-house where legal and safe, but still spent real money. $86,400 in contractor pump pulls and motor work, $41,700 in electrical and controls, $22,900 in trenching fuel and rentals, $18,600 in valves/manifolds, $9,800 in legal and easement recording, $7,500 environmental and water quality tests, plus contingency. While crews worked, requests started landing. Not rumors, not maybe if, direct asks. Brandon came first, hat in both hands, outside the shop. "I need emergency supply for my feeder lot," he said. "2 pens already rationed. If I haul everything, I'll bleed out." Crystal asked, "Daily demand?" "About 52,000 gallons if I keep weight stable." She did the math in her head, then at the desk to confirm. "I can allocate through well 3 and temporary line access. Rate is $31 per thousand, billed monthly. First principal payment due after harvest settlement. No late penalties till January 15th. He blinked. That's less than tanker quotes by half. Cheaper than liquidation," she said. "Sign if you can keep meter integrity." He signed. For the rest of that week, Brandon pulled scheduled volume, underwatched meter reads while Wade and the line crew finished tie-ins. The first statements were ugly but survivable, and the comparison to panic hall quotes was immediate. Every day he stayed online bought him margin he couldn't borrow. 3 days in, he met Wade at the gate, tapped the meter box and said, "Your wife bought me time I couldn't finance." Mitch Harlan arrived 2 days later with foreclosure papers folded in a pocket like they might burn through denim. His hog barns needed steady flow or he'd face catastrophic animal welfare decisions within days. "I can pay some now," he said. "Not all." Crystal set a separate schedule. Emergency volume at cost plus 8% instead of 12%, with a cap tied to his document herd count. Electric reconnection deposit advanced by her, $8,400 paid directly to utility, and repayment structured in 3 tranches after his lender mediation dates. "Why help me?" Mitch asked, voice flat from exhaustion. "Because dead hogs don't fix your note," Crystal said. "And because this county doesn't need another empty barn." Mitch kept water on through the first mediation window and avoided depopulation orders. His attorney, waiting outside the courthouse one afternoon, told Wade that keeping the site operating instead of collapsing into salvage could preserve roughly $190,000 in value if forced sale terms came down. Ana and Luis Reyes came on a Thursday evening, both dust-caked, both embarrassed, both carrying paperwork. Ana laid down the lender packet first. Covenant notices, collateral language, deadlines in highlighted blocks. "If we miss this month's irrigation finish," she said, "they can trigger a collateral sweep." Luis did most of the talking after that. Our intake line cracked. We can't float repair and hauling at the same time. We'll lose the South Quarter lease if we miss this month's irrigation finish." Crystal didn't lecture. She opened a yellow pad. She advanced $27,600 directly to the contractor repairing their intake and metering setup, then wrote a 0%, 9-month recovery agreement, secured by crop proceeds only, no cross-collateral on their remaining equipment. She also gave them interim access at cost rate for 1.2 million gallons while repairs finished. The effect showed up within days. The repair crew stayed on site, the irrigation window stayed open, and the lease remained in play. Luis kept taking outside overnight factory shifts to preserve family insurance while farm cash flow stabilized enough to keep every payment current through the month-end deadlines Ana had circled. And it wasn't only the headline names. Ruth Jameson, 68, with 42 cow-calf pairs on inherited ground, got connection fees waived entirely, $3,200 forgiven, and a micro-allocation at meter cost. The Patel family's produce acreage received 420,000 gallons on a delayed pay plan that matched CSA payout timing, not monthly bank draft dates. 2 Amish dairies paid in weekly envelopes exactly as promised. Crystal logged every payment to the cent and refused rounded favors because fairness required precision. By October 20th, before any formal co-op vote existed, Crystal had executed 19 interim emergency agreements covering 31 operations. Gross invoices, $412,870. Cash collected by month end, $179,000. Outstanding receivables were high by normal standards, but defaults were near zero because terms were built around actual harvest and sale calendars. Wade watched her update the board each night in the office. People will say you're running charity with pump parts," he said. She shook her head. "No. Charity ignores math. This is math with mercy." The deeper proof came when the county commissioners asked for a public water impact hearing after complaints that one family was controlling supply. The meeting packed the old annex room. Darrell sat front row with a legal pad. Prairie Meridian sent counsel. Bank reps leaned against the back wall. So did half the people who had mocked the patch jacket for years. Crystal brought binders, 3 of them. She started with acquisition detail, parcel by parcel. 1. Parcel A, $392,000 purchase, projected rehab $64,000, actual $58,300. 2. Parcel B, $221,000 purchase, projected rehab $31,000, actual $28,900. 3. Parcel C, $288,000 purchase, projected rehab $39,000, actual $41,200. 4. Parcel D, $167,000 purchase, projected rehab $24,000, actual $21,700. 5. Parcel E, $244,000 purchase, projected rehab $22,000, actual $19,400. 6. Parcel F, $251,000 purchase, projected rehab $36,000, actual $34,800. 7. Parcel G, $197,000 purchase, projected rehab $18,000, actual $16,000. $500. Total purchase, $1,760,000. Total rehab and integration to date, $220,800. Total committed capital, $1,980,800. Then operating model. Annual fixed carrying costs, taxes, insurance, baseline staffing, compliance, $81,740. Variable costs at projected demand, power, maintenance, testing, line repair reserve, $293,000. Mandatory capital reserve set aside, $74,000. Total annual cost base at full service, $448,740. She clicked to the next sheet. Yes, she had finally used a projector because the room was too big for paper. At conservative lease pricing of $31 per 1,000 gallons, projected annual delivered volume yielded $892,000 gross. Net after all costs and reserves, about $517,000. She didn't linger there. She went straight to regional impact. Before integration, farms without reliable wells were paying emergency haul rates, translating to about $19,400 per season average water burden. Under the integrated network, even at paid rates, expected burden dropped to about $6,700. Across the 63 farm service area she was planning for, that meant roughly $800,000 plus retained locally per season instead of transferred to out-of-county emergency haulers and distressed liquidations. Then she added one more table, and this one quieted the room. A 5-year distress trajectory model. If 18 highest-risk farms continued at panic haul water costs plus current interest resets, estimated 11 would breach lender covenants within 14 months. Under structured water access and harvest cycle payment terms, projected breaches dropped to 3. Estimated preserved livestock inventory value, countywide, $2.3 million. Estimated avoided forced equipment auctions, $1.1 million. Darrell raised a hand. And you profit? Yes, Crystal said, at a capped margin that keeps systems maintained. Broke infrastructure helps no one. Prairie Meridian's attorney asked, why not sell exclusivity now and de-risk personally? She answered without heat. Because extraction pricing would strip this county. I live in this county. There was no applause. Jasper County wasn't an applause county. But people stopped whispering, hoarder. When the meeting ended, Brandon waited by the door. I owe you an apology, he said. For the jokes. For all of it. Crystal tucked her binder under one arm. Pay your November invoice on time, she said. Call us even. He smiled, and for once it wasn't performative. Outside, her old F-150 coughed blue smoke when it started. Nobody laughed. The next call came before dawn, while Wade was still pulling boots on in the mudroom. Crystal picked up on the second ring. A smooth male voice said, Ms. Lawson, this is Grant Pritchard with Blue Current Water Brokerage. We represent institutional buyers looking for efficient aggregation in constrained districts. Crystal leaned against the counter and looked out at the dark yard. You're up early to say buyout. A chuckle. Direct is good. We'd like to discuss exclusive control and resale rights for your current well portfolio. We can move quickly. Cash. Send numbers, she said. By 10, she had them printed and clipped under her ledger tab. $4,800,000, all cash consideration. Exclusive external resale rights, priority off-county allocations. Wade read it once, then again. That doubles liquid, Crystal. It does. He waited. She turned the page and tapped the line about off-county priority. It also drains Jasper first, when Chicago pays more. At noon, they drove to the courthouse, where people had already heard enough rumor to form a crowd near the steps. Darrell Voss stood with two co-op men and a folded newspaper. Brandon leaned against the railing with his hat low. Prairie Meridian's loafer's man watched from near the statue, expression blank. Grant Pritchard stood out in a navy overcoat and polished shoes that never met mud. He held a folder like a man holding a checkmate. "Ms. Lawson," he said, smiling for those gathered, "we're prepared to execute today. No financing contingency. Full transfer. You and your husband can retire this afternoon." Crystal took the folder, flipped to signature pages, then looked up at him. "Grant, where does the water go in January if somebody in Cook County pays 15% more?" He didn't hesitate. "To the highest value market, as any rational commodity should. Water isn't a commodity when calves are drinking snow." His smile thinned. "With respect, sentiment is expensive." "So is liquidation," she said. She closed the folder and handed it back. "No." A ripple went through the steps, half disbelief, half relief from people who hated what the money implied. Before he could answer, Crystal turned, walked through the courthouse doors, and filed incorporation papers with the clerk. Jasper County Winter Water Cooperative member rates capped at cost plus 12%. Mandatory public annual audits. Payment schedules aligned to harvest cycles. She came back out with stamped copies in a manila envelope. Darrell stared at the envelope. "You're making a co-op?" "I'm making rules," Crystal said. "Clear ones." That afternoon, she exercised her final purchase option on the two remaining foreclosed parcels, $400, $2,000 combined, and wired earnest money before the banks closed. By the first hard freeze, the deeds were recorded. 11 functioning high-capacity wells in one district. No debt attached. First real cold hit in late November, with needles of sleet skittering across tank lids and wind that found every gap in every barn wall. At 5:12 a.m., Brandon called. "Line pressure dropped on my south pen. Meter still turning slow. I've got heifers bawling." "We're rolling," Wade said before Crystal could answer. They reached his lot under work lights and breath clouds. A coupling at the temporary branch had split clean. Wade killed flow, swapped the section, and had pressure back in 18 minutes. Brandon stood by the panel in a Carhartt, too new for his old swagger, and looked at the restored gauge like it was a pulse monitor. "You saved me another truck run," he said. Crystal was already writing numbers in her waterproof book. "You save yourself. Keep your filter clean, and get that exposed elbow wrapped before tonight." He nodded hard. "Yes, ma'am." By December, he had sold the last of his flashy extras, the grain cart he didn't need, and a side-by-side that mostly hauled pride, and brought his operating note down enough for renewal. He kept the cattle. He kept his farm. On Christmas week, he mailed a check with no reminder call needed. Mitch Harlan's turning point came in a bank conference room that smelled like dry toner and burnt coffee. Prairie State's workout officer slid papers across the table. "You're still below coverage. Without a viable utility plan, this is headed to disposition." Mitch's attorney pushed forward the cooperative service agreement and 6 weeks of meter records. "Utility plan is viable and active. Animal inventory stabilized. Revenue curve restored." The officer frowned. "At what cost?" Crystal, seated at the far end in her feed store jacket, answered from her spreadsheet. "Emergency pricing at cost plus 8 for his site until March, then standard member schedule. Total current arrears? Manageable. Default probability drops materially if you stop pricing him for failure." The banker looked irritated by plain truth delivered without a tie. "Why would you subsidize this?" "I'm not subsidizing," Crystal said. "I'm preventing scrap." In the silence that followed, the officer finally marked his form. Mitch walked out with a mediated restructuring instead of immediate seizure. In the parking lot, he leaned both hands on his truck hood and bowed his head. Not dramatic, just emptied out. "I thought I was done," he said. "You're not done," Crystal answered. "You're busy." By spring, he had trimmed herd size to match feed reality, leased out one underused barn bay, and made his first full scheduled payment under the new terms. Anna and Luis Reyes met Crystal at dusk beside their repaired intake pit, where steam drifted off fresh backfill. Luis wiped his hands on his jeans. Contractor finished pressure test. No leaks. Anna held out a folder. Lender accepted the cure package. No collateral sweep. Crystal read the first page and handed it back. "Good," Anna looked up. "We want to pay the advance back early." "Pay on schedule," Crystal said. "Keep cash for seed and sleep." Luis laughed once, tired. "Sleep sounds expensive." "It's cheaper than mistakes," Wade said from the trench edge. The Reyes operation kept both South Quarter leases. That winter, when another family's intake failed on a Sunday, Luis drove over with his own wrench set before dawn because somebody had done that for him. Ruth Jameson's scene was quieter. She called from a flip phone at 8:40 p.m. during a freezing rain warning. "Crystal? Meter's fine, but my hydrant's icing around the threads." Crystal and Wade showed up with a heat gun, insulation wrap, and 2 spare gaskets. Ruth held a flashlight with arthritic hands while Wade worked the fitting loose. "Used to be my Harold did this," she said into the wind. "Now I mostly negotiate with stubborn objects." Crystal tightened the final wrap and turned flow. Water ran clean. Ruth watched the stream hit the trough and said, "I can make calves on this." She paid every bill in neat envelope cash and homemade peanut brittle at Christmas that Crystal pretended not to like and ate anyway. The Patels came in with spreadsheets. At a folding table in the co-op office, Mira Patel slid over a color-coded cash flow map tied to CSA distributions and school contracts. "If we pay monthly, we choke in February. If we pay at member pickup intervals, we stay current." Crystal studied it, then nodded. "Approved. Same total, different rhythm." Mira exhaled. "Thank you." Their produce farm expanded to one greenhouse instead of closing one, and by March they were delivering winter greens to 2 school cafeterias that had been buying trucked-in lettuce from 3 states away. The cascade showed up in places people rarely call heroic. At Sutter Feed and Supply, the owner who had braced for mass defaults stood behind the register one snowy Saturday and said to Wade, "I expected to write off 30 grand this winter. I'm at 4,000 and dropping." At Clymer Grain, the dispatcher started seeing fewer distress sales and more normal deliveries. "Feels like a county with a pulse again," he said, stamping tickets. At Judy Klein's branch, delinquency charts that had spiked in August flattened by February, in part because farms had one major variable, water, turned from panic pricing into predictable utility cost. She showed Crystal the graph after hours, then laughed at herself. "I'm proud of a boring line." "Best kind," Crystal said. January brought the kind of cold that cracks old boards and turns diesel thick. Demand spiked. So did missed due dates. The co-op board met in the fire station hall with space heaters rattling under plastic chairs. Members came in with red hands and invoice envelopes. Treasurer numbers were blunt, overdue balances rising. Contract language allowed late penalties that month. Darrell, now elected to the interim oversight seat, by members who trusted nobody else to ask hard questions, tapped his pen. Rules are rules. Crystal opened a second folder. Rules also include emergency authority under weather declaration. She set down a one-page proposal. Temporary penalty forgiveness through January 31st. Total waive charges, $118,000. No principal forgiven. Extended schedules tied to spring settlement dates. Murmurs started immediately. Darrell frowned. $118,000 is real money. So is 63 liquidations, Crystal said. Penalty revenue this month buys us nothing if it pushes members into default spiral. A dairy operator in the back stood up. If this passes, I can keep labor another 6 weeks. Ruth raised her hand without standing. If this passes, I keep cows. Brandon looked toward Darrell. I hated this whole thing at first, Darrell. I was wrong. Don't make us perform suffering for accounting. The room went quiet. Darrell rubbed his jaw, then nodded once. Call the vote. Hands went up, nearly all. Motion carried. Afterward, while people pulled on coats, Darrell lingered by the coffee urn with Crystal. I called you a hoarder in overalls, he said, eyes on the floor. That was cheap. Crystal poured thermos coffee into her lid. You can repay me by reading the audit line by line. He gave a short laugh. That I can do. That was the end of that antagonism. Not with revenge, with responsibility. Darrell served 3 years on audit review and became the county's most annoying defender of transparent books. As for Blue Current and Prairie Meridian, both filed later attempts to acquire bundled rights in neighboring counties. They paid premium, exported water, and triggered lawsuits that chewed up returns. Grant Pritchard was moved off Midwest operations within a year. The loafer's man still appeared at hearings sometimes, but no one mistook polish for stewardship anymore. In March, the scholarship ceremony took place in the high school ag shop, where the air smelled like cutting oil and warm steel. Principal Kearns stood by a banner that read, Lawson Rural Mechanics Scholarship Fund, $250,000 endowment, Crystal, took the microphone like it might bite. This fund pays for vocational tuition, tools, and diesel certs for students who want to keep equipment running in rural counties, she said. No essays about dreams. Show your attendance, your instructor recommendation, and your willingness to work. A boy in the front row whispered, Best speech ever. Wade spoke next, shorter. If you can fix it, someone eats. They also signed papers that day for the $400,000 revolving emergency water fund, administered by a local committee with published minutes and quarterly balances posted in the library and online. No private management fees, no mystery. Locally, publicly, boringly, Crystal told the reporter, who smiled because she knew that quote would print. 5 springs later, at the co-op's annual audit meeting in the old middle school cafeteria, the roll call happened without anyone calling it that. A projector hummed. Kids banged basketballs in the gym next door. Coffee smelled like church basements. Judy Klein, now Regional Ag Credit Director, sat in the second row and whispered to a younger lender, Watch this. They make transparency look like plumbing. At the front, Darrell read the independent audit summary, in a voice still built for arguments. No material misstatements, reserve ratios compliant, delinquency under 2%, capital replacements fully funded. He looked over his glasses. Any member questions? Brandon raised a hand. Yeah. Why is line item 42 lower than last year? Crystal answered. Because you all finally stopped running over meter posts. Laughter. Brandon now farmed fewer acres than at his peak, but owned more of what he worked and slept better than when he wore gold watches. He still drove a decent truck, just not to impress anyone. He coached junior livestock and paid invoices on time. Mitch sat beside his daughter, who was interning with the co-op as a meter tech. His operation had downsized to what pencil and pasture could support, and he called it the first honest version of his farm in years. Ana and Luis Reyes arrived late from greenhouse harvest, carrying a box of winter tomatoes for the meeting table. Their intake system had become a model for low-loss retrofits, and Luis now trained apprentices one Saturday a month. Ana handled books for 3 neighboring operations for a fee and never missed a due date. Ruth Jameson, slower now but still sharp, signed in with a thick pen and handed Crystal brittle in a reused cookie tin. "Don't pretend you don't eat this," she said. Meera Patel presented a short report on the emergency fund's produce sector loans. "Default rate 0, she said, then added, "Turns out people pay when terms are sane." Wade remained Wade, grease under his nails, hair cut over a tarp, able to diagnose a pump by listening 10 seconds in silence. He still maintained that the loudest machine in Jasper County was unnecessary opinion. And Crystal, still in patched canvas when work required it, stood by the board and clicked through numbers with the calm of someone who had practiced panic-proofing for decades. Current co-op system: 11 high-capacity wells, integrated lines tested and logged. Service area: 63 farms active, fluctuating by season. Asset appraisal: $9.34 million across land and water infrastructure. Lawson household net worth after taxes and retained reserves: just over $8.1 million disclosed because rumors were louder than facts if you left blanks. The old lot, 117 planters, still ran each spring. Bent marker arm long since straightened and scarred. The used grain leg still loaded, ugly and faithful. The 1998 F-150 still coughed blue at stop signs, though Wade had finally admitted to replacing a gasket and 1 injector pump for diplomacy. People asked sometimes why they didn't buy new clothes, new house, new everything. Crystal's answer never varied. "We buy what improves function, not applause." When her uncle, yes, the same one who had joked for years, finally stopped her after a meeting and said, "You could at least get a truck without rust," she smiled and handed him a scholarship brochure. "Or we could graduate 6 more mechanics," she said. He took the brochure. That night, after the audit, Crystal and Wade drove home under a clean, brittle sky. The truck heater worked on setting 2 and nowhere else. At their gate, Wade shut off the engine and listened to the tick of cooling metal. "You ever think about what would have happened if you signed that 4.8? He asked. Crystal looked out toward the north well light, steady in the dark. "Yeah," she said. "I think about 63 foreclosure auctions and a lot of empty barns." He nodded. "Glad you're stubborn." She leaned back against cracked vinyl. "Glad you stayed." At Clymer Grain the next morning, a new clerk had set out fresh coffee with a handwritten sign: $2.25. Crystal unscrewed her thermos. The young man at the counter, who hadn't been around for the hard years, glanced at her patched sleeve and said, "You know, ma'am, coffee's not that expensive." Brandon, standing behind her with a scale ticket, laughed before she could answer. "Kid," he said, "that woman taught half this county the price of expensive." Crystal poured, capped the thermos, and stepped back into the cold. Across Jasper County, tanks filled on schedule, pumps cycled, ledgers balanced, cattle drank. Discipline had looked like poverty right up until the day it looked like salvation, and then it kept looking like discipline, which was the point all along.